Good evening, everyone. So there's a source that I want to hand out. If somebody can, if I can, thanks. Okay. Get some volunteers. Thank you, Henry. Maybe just leave the extras over there that we're going to go through tonight. For those who are on Zoom, there's a source that I'm handing out tonight. I will make sure to read it slowly and clearly so that everyone can follow. It's an English source, so that should make things a little bit easier, even if you don't have the actual text in front of you. Okay, as usual, we'll begin with a few housekeeping notes. So first, there's going to be, after tonight, we're going to have a 2-week hiatus in this series. As I alluded to last week, I'm actually going to be away for about, I think, a total of 10 days, which is probably the most I've been away from TNEC since I got here. Rena and I are managing to get away for a few days. And then as soon as we get back, I'm getting on a plane to Eretz Israel to join the Bergen County mission. It technically is past the deadline to sign up, but if anyone is interested, just from the conversations I had today, it promises to be a really, really amazing experience. I don't know if everything we're planning is going to pan out, but certainly if it does, it's going to be very, very impactful. So if you are still interested in joining, let me know, and we will try to get you in. So that is the next 2 Wednesdays. The next 2 Wednesdays we won't be meeting. However, that being said, we are more than making up for it with a far better presenter than the one you've been used to in the series. Rabbi Brody himself is going to be joining us on Sunday, August 4th. So not this coming Sunday, but the following Sunday. The author of the book that we have been studying will be joining us to offer reflections. I don't know what he plans to tell us, maybe about the process of writing the book, maybe just general reflections on the source material and the like. But he will, as Hashem, be here to present on, again, on Sunday, August 4th. That is number 2. Number 3, the final piece is, I guess at the end of last time, and as I was preparing for this time, I've come to the realization and the, I guess, concession that there's no way I'm going to be able to finish all the material I want to present in the 5 weeks that we have allotted. So we will likely extend the series. I'll let everybody know what the plan is. I printed my notes for tonight, and it was 4 pages of just outlined notes. I'm like, there's no way I'm getting through even half of this material. So we are going to do our best, and we will likely end up extending the series beyond the originally scheduled 5 lectures. What exactly that looks like, I don't know yet, but we'll certainly keep everybody posted as we continue to proceed through the book. So technically tonight's reading was section 2 of the book, a section on when one is justified in waging war and some of the tangential issues that come up with that question. And perhaps we'll get to some of that tonight. There were, again, many subsections to that that I'd like to talk about and flesh out, perhaps provide further context to. But before that, I really wanted to finish some of the material that we were, that we started covering last week and did not get a chance to finish, and some material that I think is really central to our limud as a whole, to this topic in general, that we really didn't get to cover last week. And I want to really flesh it out and talk about it tonight. So let's just begin by finishing a topic that we started with, but did not end up finishing last week. And that was the question of reprisals. The question effectively was, we have these military ethics, this code of conduct for how Jews are expected to wage war. But what happens when you are dealing with an enemy that refuses to abide by those rules of war? And what if the only deterrent is to violate those rules of war oneself? So if you have an enemy that is deliberately targeting women and children, should we in turn do the same as a matter of reprisal? That was the question at hand. I began the discussion last week, and I reiterate now that my stance on this issue should be clear, that there is no excuse for engaging that kind of conduct. I am firmly within the school that believes that we do not fight the way of our enemies, even when our enemies violate the rules of war. But we began discussing the different stances on the issue. Effectively, the ethical issue became, do ends justify means? If the only way to stop them is to engage in that kind of barbarism, let's say, we can call it what it is. If the only way to stop the barbarism is to engage in barbarism, are we justified and licensed in doing so? That was effectively the debate. And the mainstream rabbinic approach, there were exceptions, but certainly the mainstream rabbinic approach was that we do not. We do not engage in that kind of conduct. We do not engage in that kind of behavior. At the end, however, I was suggesting that even as we don't meet barbarism with barbarism, there may be room for deterrence measures that fall short of that kind of barbaric reprisal. In other words, if there is targeting of women and children and deliberate targeting of women and children, then there may be measures that stop short of reprisals. We would never engage in that kind of barbaric atrocity, but may engage in a severe kind of punishment that would serve as a form of deterrence. I give the example of Tzah's policy of demolishing homes of terrorists, because again, you have a young radicalized man who's interested, or woman who's interested in sacrificing themselves for the cause and dying a martyr's death, that there's no concern there. They're ready to die. But if they have to think about their elderly parents or grandparents or children, not nephews and nieces, who are living in the same home, who are going to be homeless, that might make them think twice. So that does, well, I mean, again, we still have terror attacks. I'm not sure, Mindy, if it doesn't work at all. You'd have to look at statistics on that. I mean, again, it hasn't stopped everything, but you don't know what would be if the policy was not in place. So it's hard to definitively say that it doesn't work. Again, you'd have to look at statistics. I'm not equipped to tell you whether it works or not. And I think, again, a premise for it to be ethical is the assertion that obviously it does. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But that is a kind of middle approach I was suggesting, whereby we will not license atrocity. There's never an excuse for deliberately targeting children who are toddlers, for example. But there may be room for a kind of deterrence measures that go beyond strict punishment for the perpetrator. But I was arguing at the end, and this is really what I wanted to focus on tonight, is that there are certain preconditions for that third approach. And I was arguing for 3 preconditions. Number 1, if the argument is the ends justify the means, then you need to make sure, and this goes directly to what you were saying a second ago, Marty, that it needs to actually achieve the ends. You need to make sure that it works, that the deterrence is actually in place. That's number 1. Number 2, as we articulated a moment ago, the means themselves cannot be reprehensible. In other words, if you're going to say the ends justify the means, we're saying that they maybe justify some means, but not all means. Deliberate targeting of children is never going to be justifiable. So that's the second qualification. And third, and this was the one that I was focusing on the most, is that it needs to come from a measured space rather than a place of emotion, retribution, vengeance, anger, hatred, etc. And this was a major theme in Rabbi Brody's work. The way he put it was there needs to be a difference between reprisal versus vengeance. And the difference between the two is subtle. But reprisal is a strategic decision that you're making, not out of a place of emotion or anger or hate, but out of perhaps even a lamented recognition that it's necessary, versus an emotional reaction to atrocity whereby you are just seeking blood because of the anger that you have or the hatred that ensues. And in highlighting that, we began discussing a quote from Rav Soloveitchik that I just handed out a moment ago that comes from his Kol Dodi Dofek. So in Kol Dodi Dofek, Rav Soloveitchik outlines what he calls 6 knocks, 6 figurative, metaphoric knocks from the divine, ways in which Hashem is knocking to us and showing us that he is present, that he is guiding the forces of history, particularly as it pertains to the Jewish people in the 20th and now 21st centuries, then of course the 20th century. And he outlines just different areas where Jewish history has defied the odds, has defied the general trends of history, ways in which God's guiding hand in history seems manifest in 20th century Jewish history. And in that, he discusses the 5th knock. And that's what I want to read right now. The 5th knock, it begins in the handout on page 37. At the bottom there, you'll see that the bottom paragraph begins with the words the 5th knock. We're not going to read all of it together, but we will read much of it. And I will tell you, actually, the last time I quoted from this passage was, I remember exactly when it was on April 1st, which was the day that we had a Zaka presentation here in Bnei Yeshurun, and there was a protest outside. And you'll get a sense of why I quoted this 5th knock in that context in just a moment. But I want to say 2 things. First, I guess, following on what I just said a moment ago, the 5th knock, Rav Soloveitchik says, is the fact that Jewish blood is not cheap, as we will see in just a moment. On April 1st, I was talking about the fact that there were people outside who were trying to make it cheap again, protesting, again, even a Zaka event, protesting our commemoration of the sacred that have fallen. We stood that night to make sure, when we had the event, when we counter-demonstrated, to make sure that the blood remains sacred and is not cheap. That was the context in which I quoted it before. The reason why I quoted tonight is I want you to read this passage forgetting everything that I just told you. I just gave you a lengthy introduction to this passage. It's from Soloveitchik's Kol Dodi Dofek, very important speech that he gave at a Mizrahi conference. It's considered one of his most important Tashkafic works. It outlines much of his approach to Zionism and why he adopted Zionism, despite the fact that his rabbinic family, the Soloveitchik family, were largely non-Zionists. So it's a very important work, but when we read it together, I want you to forget all of that and ask yourself, if you were just reading this passage in a vacuum, who would you attribute this passage to? Page 37, bottom of page 37. Again, for those on Zoom, I'm going to read it slowly and carefully. The 5th knock of the beloved is perhaps the most important. For the first time in the annals of our exile, divine providence has amazed our enemies with the astounding discovery that Jewish blood is not cheap. If the anti-Semites describe this phenomenon as being an eye for an eye, we will agree with them. If we want to courageously defend our continued national and historical existence, we must from time to time interpret the verse of an eye for an eye literally. So many eyes were lost in the course of our bitter exile, because we did not repay hurt for hurt. The time has come for us to fulfill the simple meaning of an eye for an eye. Of course, I am sure everyone recognizes that I am an adherent of the oral law of Torah Sheba'al Peh, and from my perspective, there is no doubt that the verse refers to monetary restitution, as defined by halacha. However, with respect to the Mufti and Nasser, I would demand that we interpret the verse in accordance with its literal meaning, the taking of an actual eye. Pay no attention to the saccharine suggestions of known assimilationists and of some Jewish socialists who stand pat in their rebelliousness and think they are still living in Bialystok, Brest-Litovsk, and Minsk of the year 1905, and openly declare that revenge is forbidden to the Jewish people in any place, at any time, and under all circumstances. Vanity of vanities, he says. Hevel havel. Revenge is forbidden when it is pointless, but if one is aroused thereby to self-defense, it is the most elementary right of man to take his revenge. In the next paragraph, paragraph 39, he goes on to cite biblical examples. He talks about Abraham, he talks about Moshe fighting the Egyptian, etc. He gives examples from the Torah Sheba'al Peh where there's a halachic obligation to defend oneself. And then if you turn to page 40, we'll take it from the second line. When God smote the Egyptians, he sought to demonstrate that there will always be accountability for the spilling of Jewish blood. At present, it is necessary not only to convince the dictator of Egypt, Nasser, but the self-righteous Nehru, the Foreign Office in London, and the sanctimonious members of the United Nations that Jewish blood is not cheap. Therefore, how laughable it is when they try to persuade us to rely on the declaration of the three great powers guaranteeing the status quo. We all know from experience what value can be attached to the pronouncements of the British Foreign Office and the so-called friendship of certain officials in our State Department. In general, how absurd is the request that an entire people be dependent on the kindnesses of others and remain without the ability to defend itself. Public and private honor is dependent upon the possibility of defending one's life and one's honor. A people that cannot defend its freedom and tranquility is neither free nor independent. The third of the phrases of divine redemption is, and I shall redeem you with an outstretched hand and with great judgments. Thank God we have lived to see the day when, with the help of God, Jews have it within their power to defend themselves. And then a final concluding passage that I quoted that night on April 1st. Let us not forget that the poison of Hitlerite anti-Semitism, which made Jews fair game to all, still permeates this generation, which looked with equanimity upon the horrible scene of the suffocation of millions in gas chambers as a normal event that need not be challenged. The antidote for this venom that poisoned minds and dulled hearts is the readiness of the state of Israel to defend the lives of its citizens. Listen, my beloved Knox. So you have this passage from Rav Soloveitchik that centers on this notion of ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye. And again, Rav Soloveitchik was the halachist par excellence. Rav Soloveitchik was not arguing for an interpretation, as he himself articulates, for a halachic interpretation that deviates from that of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. The Gemara tells us that it does not literally mean an eye for an eye, it means monetary restitution. Rav Soloveitchik fully concedes that on a halachic level, that's obviously what the verse means. But in this broader hashkafic context, he is saying sometimes the Jewish people, when it comes to defending ourselves as a nation, need to take this literally. Now again, if you read that passage about revenge and justified revenge, etc., and I asked you to figure out who the author was, who would you guess? Now maybe Meir. If you told me you're Rabbi Meir Kahana, I'd say okay. Maybe like there are lots of people that we might attribute this to, but it was not coming from any of those people. Who was it coming from? It was coming from Rav Soloveitchik, who was not known as a militant, who was not known as a man driven by anger or hatred, or he was not. He was a very he could be fiery. I mean, again, the most violent Rav Soloveitchik would get is if he said a bad shot in the Rambam. That was really the most upset and angry he would get. And here you have him speaking in these very firm, strong, even militant terms about the importance of striking back when the Jewish people are attacked. Rav Soloveitchik support reprisal attacks. I have no knowledge that he did, and I assume that he did not. But again, I bring it instead to illustrate the point that if an approach like that is going to be worthwhile and even worthy of serious consideration, not again in the radical sense, but I was saying in the more measured sense, where you won't engage in atrocities, but you will engage in more forceful reprisals that stop short of barbaric atrocities, and will stop short of the kinds of atrocities committed by our enemies. In order for that approach to maintain any semblance of validity, it needs to be coming from a place of belief rather than a place of emotion, of anger and hatred. And this is just one example to me where you see that. Soloveitchik was not someone who would let his emotions get the better of him, and again would really talk in these militant terms on a regular basis. If he was saying this in Kol Dodi Dofek, it was clearly something that he truly believed, and it was coming from a place of reason, and from Soloveitchik's standpoint, a proper understanding of Torah, Hashkafas Torah, Hashkafas HaChaim, that he was trying to present. So if there is going to be such an approach, I think it needs to come from a place like this one, from Kol Dodi Dofek, rather than just a place of emotion, anger, and God forbid, hatred, etc. So that, yeah, question.
What if we look at it not from as vengeance or reprisal, but as elimination of evil from this world, like a mullet?
So,
which we also say you have to eliminate women, children, and everyone because of the evil that arises from it.
It's, I mean, again, so we spoke. So Harold's raising the example of Amalek. We spoke a little bit about Amalek in our first group, in our first session, our first shiur, our first lecture on this topic. I think it's a very difficult paradigm to argue for. I think Baalei Hashkafa struggle with Amalek, and rightly so. As we were arguing, we spoke about two different approaches. Or I spoke about three different approaches: the Rav Kook approach, the Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs approach, and Rav Wilkenstein's approach to Amalek. But no matter which one you take, the notion that a child, a toddler, 0 to 5 years old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, fresh out of diapers, or whatever the case may be, right, is evil, is a very difficult argument to make, and it's one that I think we would be better to avoid. So, in theory, could one make such a theological argument? In theory, one could. Do I think one could compellingly, in a contemporary context, and act upon it? I think you're much more likely to engage in moral atrocity from a Torah standpoint. I don't mean from a general, world standpoint. I mean from a Torah standpoint, you're much more likely to engage in avera and avon than tzidkus if you pursue that route. So I think it's and again, it's noteworthy that even the rare rabbinic voices that did approve of reprisals did so as a matter of self-defense, not as a matter of bi'ar ta'ara mikirbecha or anything like that. Okay. So that was the issue of reprisals. The next issue I wanted to talk about is there a Jewish ethic of war? Which is, again, really from last week's reading rather than this week's reading, but was a major theme of the first section of the book, and really, I think, is very much a foundational question to the book as a whole. Is there any kind of Jewish ethic of war? Obviously, this book presupposes that there is, and I think that is the correct conclusion, but Rabbi Brody also chronicles the fact that it is not an obvious assumption, and there were others who assumed otherwise. So let's talk about what the different approaches were to Jewish ethics of war, what the challenges are in developing a Jewish ethic of war, and what our conclusions should be in pursuing a Jewish ethic of war. So who were some of the voices that opposed the notion of a Jewish ethic of war? So we began last week speaking about Rav Yisraeli, who felt that Judaism does not have an ethic of war. There is no Jewish ethic to warfare. So what do we have to do? We have to follow international norms, was his argument. If you recall, he had the astute wisdom to say that it's not about international laws of war, it's about international norms. It's not what about other nations say, it's about what other nations do. Because he already recognized early on that what other nations say and what they do might be two different things, and what they say to Israel or to the Jews, as opposed to what they say to everybody else, might be two different things as well. And that's something that we find quite consistently in the application of international law. So he said, don't worry about what they're saying, worry about what they're doing. And that is the standard that Klal Yisrael needs to follow. We can't fall below the standards that other nations have. In some sense, this is akin to a very controversial shach on the concept of Dina de Malchus Adina. Dina de Malchus Adina is a difficult concept to define. It's something that we'll talk about either later tonight or next week, because it also comes up in this context of Jewish ethics of warfare in other ways as well. So we will talk about it more. But Dina de Malchus Adina is effectively a halachic principle that dictates that Jews must observe the law of the land. Jews must observe the law of the land. Now, what exactly is the scope of that? What laws must Jews observe? If a government says that we have a law that every Sunday, each one of our citizens must have a bacon sandwich for breakfast, would Jews be obligated to follow that law? Quite obviously not. So what exactly is the proper scope of Dina de Malchus Adina? not so obvious, not so clear. There are some more obvious applications of it. Paying taxes is perhaps the most basic. We're obligated to pay taxes by Dina de Malchus Adina, but where it fully applies or doesn't apply is subject to halakhic debate. And there is a shach that says that one area where Dina de Malchus Adina applies is in any case where the halacha does not have a stance on an issue. You have a monetary dispute, and the halacha doesn't address it. The halacha doesn't dictate one way or another what the halacha is. Then in that case, what do? You follow the law of the land. You follow Dina de Malchus Adina. That's a statement of the shach. Chazon Ish was extraordinarily troubled by this shach. The kind of thing that if it weren't for the shach, the Chazon Ish might label this as kfira. Chazon Ish says, how can you have a case that halacha doesn't address? Halacha addresses every case. What halacha gives you is a set of principles. Here are general rules for how to assess cases at large. And every case somehow fits into the application of those principles. Sometimes it's tricky, sometimes it's hard. It's not always easy to disentangle a case and figure out which principles apply, which principles transcend other principles, etc., etc. That's the job of dayanim. And sometimes you need, for difficult cases, you need very talented, very wise dayanim who are steeped in halacha and understand people and understand economic realities in order to disentangle a case and properly apply the halacha. But how can you possibly suggest that there is no halacha to be had, that there would be that such that you'd follow Dina de Malchus Adina? So what exactly the shach meant is an interesting question. And again, I think there's a lot to be said about that also in a different context. But it's something akin to what Rabbi Yisraeli is saying. He's saying there is no Jewish military ethics. The Torah doesn't have military ethics. We don't have anything like that. So what do? You follow the practices of the nations at large. You follow the ethics of your time. That's one approach that suggests that there is no Jewish ethic. Another approach that actually emerges from this week's reading, if you look on page 183, he quotes Talmidim, Rabbi Brody quotes Rav Abiner, who in turn was quoting Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook as maintaining there is no real Jewish military ethic, but for a different reason, because he felt the only real military ethical imperative is conquer the land of Israel by any means, by anything that happens to meet that end doesn't really make a difference. That's not really the Torah's concern. All that the Torah is interested in is conquer the land of Israel. If you look at the paragraph that begins with the words "as such" on page 183, as such, by the open admission of Rav Shlomo Aviner, the primary editor of his writings, Rav Tzvi Yehuda was never concerned with addressing questions of military ethics. Bloodshed is unpleasant and undesirable. Yet, as long as we are dealing with a milchemes mitzvah for the homeland, the only question is whether we have the strength and courage to win. He is willing, therefore, not only to sacrifice the lives of enemies, but also to risk those of his own people, as long as the war can be won, since this is the nation's long-term mission. Fighting for the homeland takes precedence over saving individual Jewish lives. In the spirit, Rav Abiner regretted that the Israeli army called itself the Israel Defense Forces. The goal of the army is not just to defend the people, but to conquer the promised land. So here you have another view that says perhaps not that there is a no Jewish military ethic, but again, to use the language that's quoted here, Rav Tzvi Yehuda was never concerned with questions of military ethics because the only ethic is conquer the land. That is a second view. But I'd say neither of these views are really the mainstream when it comes to Torah thought on Jewish military ethics. I'd say the mainstream thought of poskim, akin to the intuition of the Chazon Ish in the context of Dina de Malchusa, is of course the Torah has something to say about military ethics. You know why? The Torah has something to say about all ethics. The Torah is our ethical guide, capital E, capital G. It is written by he who is perfect morally. It's almost preposterous to me to assert that there is no Jewish military ethic. And again, Lulei de Mistafina, if it were not for the fact that it were some great rabbinic authorities that espoused views like this, to me it sounds preposterous and borders on the absurd. If you really believe that, again, that Hashem is perfect morally, which we certainly believe, and that the Torah is his ethical guide, then how can one assert that in such an important area, there is no ethical guidance that the Torah has to offer us? And accordingly, you had poskim, Gedolei poskim, who would write works on military ethics. Rav Goren wrote an entire set of tshuvos called Meshiv Milchama that was all on different shilos that come up and different military ethical guidance that the Torah has to provide. A lot of it comes up in Rav Waldenberg's Hilchot Medina, where he talks about a lot of these questions as well. So you have lots of different, again, rabbinic authorities writing important works on Jewish military ethics. And to me, again, if you're asking me for a conclusion, not that it's my place to weigh in, to me, it seems crazy to say that the Torah does not offer Jewish military ethical guidance. It might be hard to parse out. It hasn't been halacha l'maisa. It hasn't been pragmatically relevant for thousands of years. You might need to go through Gemaras and Sanhedrin that for a long time were learned as just halacha shelo l'maisa, and you might have to go through the Rambam's Hilchos Malachim in order to really try to construct principles through which we can derive a practical military ethic. I'm not saying the endeavor, the intellectual endeavor, is an easy one, but it certainly exists. It's certainly there. Now, a second objection to Jewish military ethics was not the question of whether it exists or not, but the difficulty in kind of determining what they are. And here too, Rabbi Brody offers several examples where different personalities took different sources, whether they be in the Tanakh or in the Gemara, and used them to derive opposite conclusions. On page 91, he talks about the differences between Abraham and Yehoshua in terms of to what degree we should be looking at innocent civilians and sparing innocent civilians and the like. You have the question of Achan. Achan, in the context of the Yehoshua story, was a Jewish sinner who was ultimately killed for his sins. And the question of what do the ethical standards of those times apply to our times? Perhaps in a more acute and clear example, you have the instance of Shechem. Shechem is something that we spoke about. I've spoken about in the past. I spoke about it on Shavuos in the context of how Jews conduct ourselves militarily, and the question of innocent bystanders or innocent civilians. What is the role of innocent civilians in urban warfare, etc. So you have this instance where Shimon and Levi, two of the Shvatim, they annihilate an entire city, and you are left with the question of how are we to understand that event. So he quotes Rabbi Maimon, who's going to be a major character in the coming chapters, who says that Shimon and Levi were correct. They were right. The fact that Yaakov challenges them, and they respond to Yaakov, and Yaakov is silent, Yaakov has no response for Shimon and Levi, indicates that Shimon and Levi were justified. They were correct. Rav Goren and others argued that no, they were incorrect. But Yaakov Avinu was correct. And that's certainly the mainstream interpretation. Remember, Yaakov rebukes Shimon and Levi on his deathbed. So even though they get the last word in that story, he rebukes them once again. But even within the question of why they were wrong, to what degree were they wrong? I would argue that even though Shimon and Levi were likely wrong, and I think that's the mainstream approach to that story, one cannot argue that Shimon and Levi were wanton mass murderers. We consider Shimon and Levi tzaddikim. So even if they erred in some moral way and they again made some mistake, Yaakov Avinu critiques them, to just say that everybody there was innocent and they were literally just mass murderers. These again, two of the Shvatim, including the father of the priestly caste, right? Shevet Levi ultimately became those who served in the Beis HaMikdash. To say that they were just, again, wanton mass murderers is to me inconceivable as well, if we're trying to develop an approach that's true to our Masorah. So who was right? Who was wrong? If they were wrong, why were they wrong? To what degree were they wrong? You end up with lots of different approaches. And because there are so many different approaches, some would argue that that's a disqualifier to the entire enterprise of Jewish military ethics. There's a great quote that he says on page 108. If you turn to page 108. The top paragraph there. Some might even claim that the religious texts are essentially invoked in order to consecrate previously held ideological beliefs. Choose whatever answer you want, and you can find the Jewish source to defend it. Jewish values aren't driving people's behavior. Instead, Jewish texts are being used to support political decisions. At the very least, the relationship between religion and politics is complex, with one supporting the other and leading to very different perspectives, all speaking in the name of religion. If you read this paragraph, effectively the argument is there's no Jewish military ethics. Choose a position and then start going through Jewish sources and you'll find something to support it. So it's hard to really start with the sources and to derive conclusions from the sources. Quite to the contrary, people are starting with their conclusions and their previously held beliefs and then going back to the sources to support them. And I will say there is some merit to this critique. I think you will often find political pundits doing exactly this. Political pundits on both sides of the political spectrum will start with their political beliefs that happen to fit their particular ideology, their particular cause, and then they'll go back and they'll cherry pick sources that happen to support their particular view. If you've read a little bit about moral reasoning, this is actually quite in line with much human psychology pertaining to moral reasoning. Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist at NYU, has done a lot of research on this. Very often people will start with their conclusions and then they will work backwards to find the source material that tries to support it. And I think that yields two conclusions. Sometimes I think political pundits are just flat out wrong. I think they just radically misinterpret sources. They take sources out of context. they don't properly understand them, or they understand them in a very facile, simplistic way without understanding the layers of complexity that are added by our commentaries. You quote a Gemara, but you don't look at Rashi and Tosfos and the Rambam and the Rishonim, then you're likely to be engaging in an oversimplification at best, and perhaps a distortion at worst. And number two, even when they're right, even when they quote the text correctly, there's no illusion that their thought or conclusion derives from those sources. It's very often quite clear that they had a conclusion, they had an agenda, and they're going back to the source material in order to justify it. So if that's the critique of Jewish ethics, I will start by saying there is some validity to that critique, and there are some instances in which that is precisely what happens. People start with conclusions and then go back to the source material to justify their personal views. However, that being said, you're trying to use that as a disqualifier for the enterprise of Jewish military ethics as a whole. I think that critique dramatically fails. And I'll tell you why. If that critique is successful in eliminating Jewish military ethics, it's also successful in eliminating all other Jewish ethics, i.e. all other areas of halacha as well. You know why? Because in all other areas of halacha, there are ample machlokos, there are debates that animate the entirety of halacha. It doesn't matter what area of halacha you choose, you will find machlokas. Machlokas is quite core to the enterprise of halacha. So it doesn't matter if it's kashrus or Shabbos or taras hamishpacha or tefillah, or it doesn't matter what it is. You will always find debates. And what happens in those debates is different Rishonim will marshal different sources to support their conclusion. Rashi will quote a Gemara in Maseches Bava Kama, and Tosfos will quote a Gemara in Maseches Bava Metzia, and the Ramban will quote a third Gemara in Maseches Kiddushin. And in the end, you have this cacophony of voices, all with different opinions, marshaling sources to support their arguments. So what makes it work? If indeed you can create so many, or you can reach so many different conclusions depending on which sources you take. So what makes it work is the integrity of the practitioners. You are assuming that when Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam come to a Gemara, they're not coming to a Gemara with a preconceived conclusion that they constructed for themselves and then are trying to retrospectively justify their position. When the Rambam and the Rabbi disagree about something, it's not because the Rambam was dogmatic about opinion X and the Rabbi was dogmatic about opinion Y, and then they came to the Gemara in order to derive their conclusions. When it comes to the greatest practitioners of halacha, whether it be in the times of the Rishonim or today, we trust that there is an integrity to the system whereby, yes, they might derive different conclusions, but it's all coming from an honest interpretation of the sources that might yield different conclusions. And why might it yield different conclusions? For all sorts of reasons, because of the disposition of the posek, because of the weight that they put on one source versus another. There could be all sorts of reasons why they choose one source over another, or why they interpret the source in one direction as opposed to another direction. But if you entrust the integrity of the system, that is basically the essence of how halacha operates in all areas. And Jewish military ethics should be no exception. And throughout chapter 8, he points to all sorts of tensions between different Jewish military ethics. How do you value the dignity of all human life versus the primacy of self-defense? That's a tension that the Jewish people have to deal with every single day. And when I say every single day, I mean today, every single day. We believe that there is dignity and sanctity in all human life. Every human being is created b'tselem Elokim. And there is a moral imperative to defend the Jewish people from existential threats, from those who would seek to destroy us. How do you balance those two things? That's what Tzahal is trying. Every time they are going to the board, to the authorities to justify a particular strike or to determine whether a particular strike is in accordance with Tzahal's values, that's exactly what they're weighing. How do you balance the value of not targeting the innocent while recognizing that war is by its very essence a collective affair? It's a nation against another nation. How do you balance those things? So those aren't easy questions. And you will certainly have differences of opinion. Among poskim, if you would ask their positions on particular issues, you will definitely have differences of opinion. But from my standpoint, that doesn't disqualify the endeavor of Jewish military ethics. It just means that this too is another area of halachic interpretation subject to the different perspectives of Gedolei Torah, who must and always approach the sources with basic integrity and reverence for the text, but yet may yield different conclusions. In the end, Rabbi Brody proposes a Jewish multi-value framework, what he calls the JMF, on page 111. We could just scan it together. In some ways, it's an arbitrary framework. It's not like he's quoting the Rambam, who says that this is the value system that we need to work with. But he tries to put together lots of different values. I'm sorry, turn to page 108. Where he tries to outline lots of different values that animate Jewish military ethics. So he has dignity of mankind. All human beings, friends and foe alike, were created in the image of God. Inherent wrong of illicit bloodshed, right? Lo terzach, you should not kill. We don't gratuitously kill people. 3, individual responsibility. Individuals bear primary responsibility for their actions and should ideally bear the sole weight of responsibility for their actions. Visions of world peace, that ultimately our vision for the end of time is a world in peace. Warfare in pursuit of justice. Until the Messianic era, the Bible calls upon his followers to take up arms for the sake of justice. And then look at 6, 7, and 8. Warfare by its nature is a collective affair. Nations are at war with each other. If the Jewish people are going to war with another nation, that is one nation against another. Now, again, obviously that stands in tension with number 3, which focuses on individual responsibility. But his point is that's the tension through which the Jewish ethical values are framed. A national partiality. The primary responsibility of political leaders and citizens is to protect their own people. This is something that is entirely lost on so many contemporary quote-unquote ethicists in the secular world today. It's all about numbers. It's all about numbers. Which side had more people die? And that's how you determine who's ethically right and who's ethically wrong. As opposed to national partiality. I have an obligation to defend the citizens of my nation from those who would seek to kill them. It's not because I'm bloodthirsty. It's not because I'm looking to kill members of another nation, but I need to place that prime responsibility of national defense, of defending my own citizens, that it comes first in terms of my hierarchy of values. Now, again, does that stand in tension with number 1, the dignity of mankind, that every human being is created in the divine image? Yeah, there's definitely a tension there. But Rabbi Brody, I think, correctly argues they are nonetheless both true. He adds bravery and courage, national honor, this entire framework of different military values that do indeed stand in tension with one another, but it might not be simple, but it's complex, it's sophisticated, at times it can be confusing, at times it can be challenging, but it's a much more honest approach to military ethics than just taking, again, one monolithic view of a particular value and saying that it applies in all cases and at all times. So I think Rabbi Brody's assertion in the end that there certainly is a Jewish ethic of, or a Jewish set of ethics of military engagement, ethics of warfare, is certainly true. And I think he does a nice job of at least making a list. Again, I'm not saying it's a comprehensive list. I'm not saying it's an exhaustive list. There might be things that he didn't mention. There might be other categories that perhaps you can break into 2 subcategories. I'm not saying it's the exhaustive list, but I think he does a nice job of summarizing some of the major values that really characterize the Torah's perspective to military engagement, and in the end create this multi-value framework. Okay, that is Jewish military ethics. And now, with the time that we have remaining, we can move into this week's actual reading. Before I do that, any questions on any of the above, on our summation of reprisals, or the question of whether there's a Jewish military ethic? Yeah, Brian. So in chapter, I think it was chapter 9, I think he does, so the question was, can Hiroshima and Nagasaki ever be deemed ethical? If you look in chapter 9, I think he does a very nice job of treating that question precisely. And he doesn't make a definitive assertion one way or another, but he does point out that the question is way more complex than people make it out to be. The standard assumption nowadays is that it was immoral to do it because of all the innocent civilians that were killed, and because contemporary military ethics focuses almost exclusively on rights, on human rights, it was the right of those people to not be killed, and that I think is the standard assumption of ethicists today. He points out that assertion suffers from 2 almost opposite flaws. One is the benefit of hindsight, and one is the fog of hindsight. What I mean by that is as follows. The assumption of those military ethicists is that the war was won without Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's the assumption. So he points out 2 things. Number 1, that's not entirely clear at all. The assumption that the war was won at the point of the bombing of Dresden, he really talks about it there, was not at all obvious. And perhaps the best counterproof is the Battle of the Bulge, which happened after the bombing of Dresden and was a major Nazi counteroffensive to the Allied invasion of Europe. So number 1, he says it's not obvious that the war was won. So that's I'd say the fog of distance, where you assume that it was won, but it's not entirely clear that you have your facts correct. The second point that he makes is even if the facts were correct, even if it's true that the war was won at that point, you have the benefit of hindsight and knowing that the war was won at that point, which the actors who were making those decisions, whether it be Truman or Churchill, whoever was making those decisions, they did not have that definitive, clear knowledge that the war was going to be won by the Allies at that point. So he argues that there are really, again, 2 major flaws with this assessment that it was obviously immoral. Now, he's not telling you that it was the right decision. These are extraordinarily difficult decisions to make, but he is definitely taking a broadside against those who would sit at a comfortable desk chair in the 21st century and kind of make sweeping decisions as to whether it was right or wrong. And I think he does a very nice job of assessing the ethical sensitivities there. Carl, yeah. Sorry, Carl had a question. Yeah.
He make a point in the chapter that by doing organ bombing, they save many lives.
But well, no. Again, he's saying it is possible that they saved many more lives. In other words, again, he's not definitively saying that. How can he say that? He's saying it is quite possible that they saved many more lives by doing it. That is the ethical argument for saying it.
Because the war is still on.
Right, correct. Again, we don't know what would have happened without dropping the right, exactly. But he's saying it is possible that they saved many more lives, and therefore he's arguing that it is not so simple to just say that it was an immoral decision. Correct. Yeah.
I think the assessment at that time was that in order to conquer Japan, you'd have to actually go to Japan, and they, I think the
Yeah.
was that.
Correct. And that correct. So that is so again, if you look at chapter 9, he outlines many of those arguments. Right. If you look at chapter 9, he outlines exactly that question, what an invasion of the mainland Japan would take, etc. So, okay, that covers, I think, last week's. Again, unless there are any further questions on any of that. Okay, let me just introduce next week, and then we'll head over to Mincha at 8:15. The next section is going to be, okay, assuming that there is a right to engage in certain wars, when can one properly engage in war, and what are the proper parameters for engaging in war? Bisman hazeh. 8:10 Mincha? Okay, we're going to conclude here. Wishing everybody a wonderful evening. We're going to run over to Mincha, and we will, Be'ez Hashem, pick up in a few weeks' time. Have a good night, everyone.